Right is Dr. Timur Tatlioglu, and he is partner and head of historic environment and townscape. And then we have here John Neale, head of research and strategic insight. Both play critical roles at Montagu Evans. Welcome to both of you. Montagu Evans being the leading UK property consultancy offering expert advice in real estate planning and development.
Thank you very much for the introduction, and thank you also to be invited to speak where so many other very, very good speakers have been before us, so we're very pleased and thank you for having us. What we wanted to do, well, first of all, thank you for introducing me. That sort of saved me a job now, but I lead our historic environment and townscape team at Montagu Evans. We work on taller buildings, regeneration of town centres and cities, as well as numbers of listed buildings. And I will come on to talk about some of the other projects we've been involved with towards the end of the presentation and the talk this evening, to really point out and draw out some of the issues we've been having. John, do you want to say a little bit about you?
Yeah, sure. I'm John Neale. I'm head of research. I did actually send Lucy a rather verbose version of what I do before I joined, which probably baffled everyone, including myself. So apologies for that. But I basically I write and research about property, economics, development, and try and provide support for the rest of the business, basically. But I'm also interested as a sort of sideline, I think, in the kind of history of planning and kind of building in a more general sense, not architecture per se in the UK, and I'll try and bring that into the talk tonight. So what we're going to do today, first of all, just talk a bit about the evolution of the office building, I think, just to highlight how things have changed so much in a relatively small period of time, how relatively recent the office is, I think, as a human invention, what the current challenges are, if we look at the data in terms of how the office market's being impacted. The slides I have and the piece of work I did on office obsolescence came out a few months ago. It's UK-wide, but I'll try and make it as relevant to London as possible. The market evidence, how we can see that really changing. And then finally, my team is going to really do most of the heavy lifting on what's happening in terms of conservation rules, conservation practice, although he will be jumping in throughout to provide a bit more of the kind of academic side of buildings we're going to show you in the first section, because that's not my specialism. What I'm going to try and talk about is the economic kind of technological developments that drove the changes in the office market. So we'll try and run through this because hopefully, well, I think some of you will already know a lot of this, but it's just to provide the background for the later report, and also just to get you thinking about how much has changed in such a little time. The first thing is that the office as we know it, the office building, is relatively short-lived phenomenon. It's basically about 300 years old. If you go back to the beginnings of London as in its current form, with stockbrokers and merchants, insurers, brokers, and so on, it all starts in coffee houses. There aren't any offices at that point. You have places like Jonathan's, places like Lloyd's, of course, which gives birth to the insurance company, because it's where merchants and sailors used to meet, and they wanted to get insurance for their ships before they went on a voyage, and that's why it turned into an insurance company. You had Jonathan's, which is where stockbrokers met, and they used to chalk up the prices of stocks and commodities on the wall. And you also had places like Garraway's, which were more of a kind of general merchant meeting place, and also lawyers would hang around in the coffee houses as well. So the whole point about this is, work or office type work doesn't have to happen in offices. It happened in other places in the past, and this was before there was such a huge need, I think, for storage, for filing, for clerical services. And we're now in a situation where the office looks a bit more superfluous again. But we do have, in the subsequent century, in the 18th century, the emergence of purpose-built offices, which really start, I think, with the Admiralty building, which is on Horse Guards Parade, which is really the first kind of administrative office building. Another option is East India House on the left-hand side there. That's obviously not a government building. It's the company, the trading company that bizarrely ended up ruling India for about 100 years before it became part of the British government. But that's also a purpose-built office. That's actually on the site of, I think, the Lloyd's building now, but it was demolished in the 19th century. So these are the first examples of that coming through. And what's driving this, I think, is the rise partly of empire, partly of trading companies, and just a generally kind of administrative state which is taxing more, mainly I think for the purposes of war. But obviously as the state moves into other parts of life, the need for administration becomes more significant. The first commercial buildings, office buildings, really are not so much in London but in Liverpool, where I think just the size and scale of the Lancashire cotton industry, which was of course the biggest export industry for 100 or so years in the UK, demanded that you have, given the scale of some of those ventures, given the scale of import and export activity, that you need some sort of office to really, I think, bring administrative functions together and to store documents and so on. And you can see the Brunswick buildings on the left-hand side of the list. I think it's the Brunswick buildings in Liverpool, which I think is generally acknowledged as the first kind of properly commercial office building. What really then changes things, of course, is the invention of the lift. There's a Mr. Otis there. I hadn't realised that when you see that name in a lift, it's actually referring back to the inventor of the lift, demonstrating the possibilities to an American audience. And that starts to allow offices to go higher. And I think at the same time, it's not just about the lift. That's a technological advance that makes it possible. It's about the concentration of humans in a smaller space within the core of the city, brought about by the rise of commuting, the rise of transport. And that's when you start to get what economists now call agglomeration benefits from bringing together people in the same place. And that creates the economic driver to create more office space in a smaller amount of physical space. And thus the move up. But I think Britain is a bit of an outlier here because Britain's now going into a period towards the end of the Victorian era when we become a bit more insecure about our place in the world. You have the rise of competition from the US and the rise of and Germany as well. And you start to see Britain withdrawing a bit from the technological frontier, becoming a bit more nostalgic and anti-urban, starting to dream of moving to the country, as a nation, and you get the Garden City movement and so on. But that comes out, I think, in some of the urban architecture too. There's actually a height restriction brought in London in the 1870s, following Queen Anne's mansions, which was one of the office buildings by St James's Park now, one of the government office buildings, which was built at about 16 stories and absolutely horrified everyone, including Queen Victoria, who hated the image of it over St James's Park. The London County Council claimed that it was a fire risk as well. It was over the limit of where they thought it was possible to spray a hose from ground level. And the LCC then introduced a height ban of 80 and then 90 feet for any building across the whole of London, which basically prevented the sort of office development you were getting in, say, New York. But I think that's... I'll come back in a minute to talk about the 60s, which I think is when the office market as we know it, the London office scene as we know it, started to emerge. But I'll pass over to Timur now to talk about some of the buildings that I've run through so rapidly without paying sufficient attention to the aesthetics.
And that's where I come in. And I've put in lots of pretty pictures, and I'm going to go add a canter through the first part of the 20th century and then later part of the 20th century. But I have to say I focused a bit more in the 1920s, 30s, and then just after the war. Partly because I'm interested, but also because towards the end, I think we will kind of understand what's happened, particularly in the 80s and 90s. But just picking up from what John was saying, at this point there were many offices. They were by later standards pretty drafty, load-bearing exteriors, fixed dividing walls. But Liverpool was an early district where you had some great buildings, and this is a beautiful example. Very early 1864. Called Liverpool Oriel Chambers. It had pioneering in use of express cast iron construction. It was contentious at the time. It was moved away from the stylistic preferences of the period. You've got a bit of Jacobean gable to the top, a bit of medieval Gothic that I see in here, and a bit of symmetry of the classicism. But it was the first that was drawing on the American architecture of long glazed facades. Now, if we skip 40 years ahead to the Edwardian architects, and you start to find, particularly at the turn of the 20th century, smaller infills, and it's a bit more playful. There's a bit of arts and crafts, a bit of freestyle, more so than the revived classical styles. And this is 3 Soho Square, which is great too, but particularly quite playful where it is and contextual. But it was during this period where the fully framed construction, the first in steel, then in reinforced concrete, offered improvements to layout, flexibility over load-bearing brick iron. And in 1909, you have the reform with the Steel Frame Act, which allowed thinner walls, more office space. And of course, the Ritz, one of the first buildings with a steel frame. There seems to be a bit of debate exactly which one is the first. I've heard about Selfridges, I've heard this one and others as well, but it's certainly one of the first substantial in steel frame. And of course, as John has said, height was restricted to 100 foot or there for fire safety. You tend to find a late Victorian Baroque giving away to neo-Palladial classical revival frontages, but the real outlier and real progressive design was Holland House, which is, as we were discussing before, this really difficult to photograph, and I must admit I've stolen this from somebody who's done it. And this was an outlier. It's for a Dutch architect, for a Dutch firm, it's an outlier because of its singular design and faience with granite plinth, strongly expressed frame. But the interior, which you can still see, the entranceway is still quite opulent. And at this time, the entrances were an important feature. Then we come to the interwar period, and here the 20s and 30s responded to new ways of thinking about architecture and design. You've got the car, social changes, technological innovation, feminised workforce as well. And the buildings were conventionally either custom-built HQs, headquarters, we've got a few examples, speculative development, or sometimes you have prestige, multi-tenanted developments. And seeing forward what we've come to know about offices more recently. And there was also a trend towards more scale and bulk, and you certainly had more buildings hitting that 100-foot mark. But in the 1920s, the very large banking headquarters were seen and in a variety of styles. And this is Herbert Baker's very dominant, inventive approach to classical language. It was the earliest to have this very monumental character of tall Portland stone frontages, surfaced modelling, sculptural accents, and sculpture at this point was really quite important to adding an additional level of interest. And then you also have variety and massing in the upper parts. And then part of the group of HQs, here's Burnett and Tate's with Lomax Simpson's Unilever House on New Bridge Street. It was designed in a stripped back classical manner with strong sculptural accents again. But by the same practice, about 10 years earlier, you have Adelaide House, influenced by the American models of Egyptian revival, the tallest building in London at its time, now dwarfed by the Shard in the background. But this building was interesting because it housed different businesses with mutual dependency. So it had everyone together in a way that actually the city was functioning at this point. It also had pioneering central ventilation system, telephone exchanges and electricity on each floor. You know, things we take for granted, obviously, pioneering in these days. But on Fleet Street, we had a bit more bold contemporary elevations, such as the Daily Telegraph building by Elcock and Sutcliffe with T.S. Tate. Quite a jazzy frontage with Egyptian and French modern touches. And then not far away and around the same time, you have Sir Owen Williams' Daily Express building, which was explicitly Art Deco, the first near continuation of curtain walling in London using vitrolite, pigmented structural glass and chrome. But these were kind of the exceptions to the norm, and Simon Bradley in the City volume of the Buildings of England says, in less up-to-date buildings, the 1930s see a stripped, simplified manner which takes over. And these were dignified but undemonstrative buildings designed to attract tenants, generally conservative in a generally conservative sector, and to fit into the established looks of the interwar city. And here's 40 Lime Street recently got a certificate of immunity from listing. A lot more simple with punched openings for the fenestration, not the same level of aesthetic attention as you have in some of the others. Then we have the influence of the design because there's a lack of fluorescent lighting at this stage, so you need to get daylight into the floor plates. And by the end of the 20s, floor plates were between 50 to 25 feet, and by the end of the decade it got to about 25 feet. And this is 55 Broadway by Charles Holden, where you have a cross-plan form for a tapering corner site, and the cross was to get the light into those relatively narrow floor plates. Interestingly, the upper parts, the upper 2 stories, couldn't be occupied because of the 100-foot rule, because of the issues with fire safety. But this is also expressing those punched openings, the vertical and horizontal set within a relaxed or plain classical exterior. Another example here is 1-4 Argyle Street, the American Radiator Company. It's only building in the UK by Raymond Hood, which was taken from, and it was the same company, same architect who came in from the Tool building in the American Radiator building in New York. But then you also have buildings of less quality, and it's really important that there's lots of highly graded listed buildings in this presentation, but there's also buildings that are kind of okay, quite workmanlike. They did what they needed to do. This is a late 1930s kind of Queen Anne style by Gunton and Gunton, very workmanlike. It's not a fine, wasn't a fine example of its type. And showing on the right-hand side was the make redevelopment. It wasn't a retrofit or a redevelopment. The elevation was rebuilt to get a bit more daylight into the floor plates that were set in behind. And then just finishing at this point was the technologies that were influencing the interior layouts. And I say this, not because this is all very interesting, which I think it is, but also it's what we're finding in the retrofit projects that we're dealing with now. So we had banks of electric lifts, which were moving. Later, we find at the moment they're sort of in the centre of the plan. They then move to the outside. Mechanical ventilation, the entrance hall and staircase was the most important up to the 30s. But by the 30s, the stairs had started to disappear, and the elevator lobby was the most notable feature. You also have corridors generally, which lead off to offices for principals, and then on the upper floors you tend to have the board offices. And then I'm going to hand over to what happens post-war.
Yeah, thanks, Timur. I think the point I was going to make here is that the office development market, as we know it in London, is largely a product of what happened after the Second World War. So there's a couple of factors that are driving this huge boom in office construction we see in the late 50s and early 60s. But the office buildings that Timur just showed you, there is the odd speculative example. Most of them are built for specific companies, for specific purposes, an HQ building, for example. But what you see after the war is a whole industry developing, which is basically providing buildings speculatively into the market that are then bought by pension funds. There's a number of reasons for that. The first one was you had residential rent controls after the Second World War. And a lot of the big insurance companies were invested in those residential buildings. They actually sold those off because of the rent controls, because they couldn't see any point in holding on to them. You started seeing yields falling backwards because of the increase in prices and the owner-occupation market, whereas rents were stagnant because they were legislated to be stagnant. And you saw a huge wave of money into different sectors, most obviously commercial property. Secondly, London needed to be reconstructed after the war, a lot of bomb sites around the place. The other factor, I think, as well, was this huge increase, which I think the government hadn't anticipated because it still thought of Britain as a very industrial country, in service sector employment. So, huge increase in administrative jobs, kind of white-collar jobs. And the other thing is there were lots of planning loopholes that developers could use. So there was something called the third schedule, which I won't bore anyone with, but effectively meant that developers could buy existing buildings and add 10% to the area. Now, if you're buying an old building and turning it into a modern office building, you can add a lot more than 10% to the area. And it became basically impossible for a long period for the city or Westminster to control office development beyond some of the height restrictions, which I think were actually removed in the mid-50s. So you have this pattern emerging where, developers, and this is where some of the great names of the industry begin, like Lord Samuel, who goes on to found Land Securities, and Hammerson also come from this period where they're buying either old buildings to redevelop, or they're buying bomb sites. And also, you see the rise of some of the big names in surveying as well. So, James Lang Wotton come from this period. Also, Healy and Baker as well. They were very active in the market at that point. And effectively, the rise of the kind of developer as hero as well, or anti-hero in most cases, someone like Harry Hyams, who is basically using bank finance to buy land with very little of his own capital, going on to sell it to pension funds like L&G. And this is still really, the model that exists in the market today. So I'm going to hand back to Timur now to talk about some of the 60s buildings that resulted from that.
Yeah, exactly. Well, In the immediate period after the war, the offices conveyed an image of stability. You had conservative architecture, and I think the epitome of vertical window, classical detailing was the Time and Life building in Mayfair. So you have this stepped roof as well behind, which took over from the traditional mansard from about the 30s onwards. And then in 1956, the 100-foot height restrictions were lifted. So you start to get taller buildings. And of course, not long after, you have the commercial boom resulting in adventurous buildings by young architects, and this is New Zealand House by RMJM, which took the slab and podium approach directly from Lever House in New York. Bunchafter later actually designed the Heinz HQ in Hillingdon, which is this lovely low-set office building with a central courtyard, grade 2 star now, worth going to see if you can. And then also you have Millbank Tower in the mid-50s, and then Centrepoint by the early 60s as well. So, both in the mid to early 60s. And there also, it's worth noting, when I was looking at this, you also had Hilton Hotel, not offices, but in Mayfair, but drawing a lot of attention and objection because of a tall building next to the Royal Parks in Mayfair. So it's foreshadowing what the types of discussions that we have today. But we also have smaller infills too at this stage. So on Albemarle Street, this is 41 Albemarle Street on the left-hand side by Peter Morrow and Partners, described in the Architects Journal as clean and shapely. I don't necessarily see that myself, but the brief was to maximise the site, and so included this curtain walling, glazed front with shop front, and then you have this lower extension to the rear. And then on the right-hand side, you had Goldfinger's speculative office, which are two separate buildings and designed in the golden section. It has a precast concrete and vitrolite, and then you have a clear story, which isn't so visible here, which is sort of set back in, which improves the lighting to get back into the floor plates. But again, you also have some pretty average buildings. So this is 1 to 19 Victoria Street. Similarly, this is public sector. This was built for the Board of Trade, and it's pretty unremarkable, I would say, given its location right next to Westminster Abbey, and it's now subject to AHMM's deep retrofit. You also find at this stage, so moving slightly outside of London, the importance of the car. You also find headquarters HQs outside of London in Greenfield, and this is Bird's Eye headquarters in Walton-on-Thames, which was grade 2 listed. More recently, it's been demolished and replaced because the facade and the concrete facade was failing, and there really was no way to repair it. And then in the 60s, moving into the 70s, you also then have the NatWest Tower as the financial institutions amassed mixed portfolios, and you have these larger developments. But I'm going to hand over to you to talk about what happened in the 70s.
Sorry, thanks. I mean, the office boom in London of the mid-60s, which also took place to a smaller extent in Birmingham as well, which was in a much more affluent city than today in comparative terms, was brought to an end by the Prevention of Office Development Acts in the mid-60s, which I think colloquially are referred to as the Brown Ban. So this is a time when the government is terribly concerned about what it calls congestion in the middle of cities. It's really worried about population concentrating too much in the centre of places like London and wanted to spread around the country a lot more, and is also concerned about the whole north-south divide, perhaps even more so than today, particularly given the very visibly failing industries of the north of England. And it basically says, right, you can't build any more offices in the middle of London. And that's in place really for about almost 15 years then. So this is why you see a bit of a gap in the architectural record at that point. It has some strange side effects though. So you see Croydon emerging, building like millions of square feet of office space because you can't build it in central London. And you see the emergence of some of the office centres around the M25 at the same time, from Basildon or Watford, or even around the Thames Valley as well. Although, if you look back over that boom, it did have some benefits as well, because the development activities made Route 11 impossible to build, which was I don't know if you know where London Wall is, but there's a sort of strange dual carriageway that emerges at that point, and then vanishes. And it's flanked by office towers from the 60s period. But the reason that didn't go ahead was because it was going to be a kind of a ring road around the city, basically, concrete ring road, again, obviously other places around the country, to allow vehicular access to the city. But because of the scale of the office boom, they realised this was totally impractical given the number of people who then worked in offices. So if it hadn't been for that boom, despite the sometimes unimpressive results of it, we might have had a great big ring road and stilts around the city of London. But I'm going to pass back to Timur now to talk about the 80s. But of course, what really changes after the 12, 13, 14 years of the Brown Ban, which is chipped away at by successive governments, is the arrival of the Thatcher government in '79, who immediately get rid of the prevention of the Control of Office Development Acts, and at the same time you start to see the growth of the financial service industries as part of the Big Bang, and has some architectural results which Timur will go through.
Yeah, which look, I'm spending less time on this because it's a bit more recent. I think a lot of you will be already, will understand, and some of you will remember it as well. So at this point you have an owner-occupied market that's reinvigorated also by younger, innovative designers. So you have the emergence of postmodernism, high-tech. I'm not going to go through that, we understand that. But some of the things that we're seeing in the buildings that we're looking to retrofit and work with are, for example, atriums that appear. Here's the BT building, which was, well, the BT Centre, but it wasn't a particularly high quality building. But you do have the atrium, which brings light down into the floor plate, used also for ventilation, but also a bit more of a challenge when you're looking to reuse the spaces in a particularly in a good way. What you also find are the floor plates become broader, service cores shift to the perimeter, as I sort of alluded to earlier, and that frees up the internal space. And then I'll finish with the sort of the epitome of the 80s and 90s with Lloyd's building and the One Poultry. And then I'll hand over to you for your parts.
Thanks. So I think again, this is so recent, I'm not going to go through it in any more detail, but we have the rise of Canary Wharf because you have a lot of US banks coming in after the Big Bang, after the deregulation of British financial services, and they want big trading floors, they want American-style buildings, they want tall buildings as well, and that happens at the same time as the need to try and regenerate the Docklands, which have been the only kind of really visible sign in London, I think, of the industrial decline that's been so widespread in the north of the country. And it's all done through a development corporation, so you don't have to worry about planning. But of course, that forces the city, which has been, still very conservative in terms of its approach to tall buildings, to reinvent itself. And that's now caused problems for Canary Wharf, which is facing really high levels of vacancy, serious problems around obsolescence, and not necessarily that many easy ways for reinvention, although there were some great, interesting options being explored. But the whole point about that, just as well as it being generally interesting, is to demonstrate quite how much offices have changed since they were first conceived, sort of extensions of coffee houses, really, kind of 300 years ago, and where we are now, but also how much has changed really in the last 20 or 30 years, in particular, as well. So I think that rate of change will carry on, and the central point of this talk is to try and explain what those economic trends are. And I think government will probably have less of a role than it did in the 20th century for fairly obvious reasons. But the one thing, and this has been happening really for, I suppose, at a north-south level, it's been happening for most of the 20th century. But in terms of the urbanisation of employment, this has really accelerated in the last 20 or 30 years. So the inner chart here is showing where jobs were created, broken down into what I've called the big central London, the big six cities, which are the big office markets outside London, which is in rough order Manchester, Birmingham, Edinburgh, Glasgow, Bristol, and Leeds and Bristol, which account for the largest sort of plurality of offices outside London, and then other inner London. And you can see in the 10 years leading up to the financial crisis, about a quarter of new jobs were created in those locations. Over the 10 years since 2012, so the 10 years up to the end of 2022, it was almost a half. So basically you're seeing more and more jobs being created in the centre of cities. And a lot of that is about London, but it's also about some of the regional cities as well. And I think that with the regional cities, it's more about the city centres becoming more popular locations within the regional context, rather than them becoming necessarily the leaders of a kind of general northern renaissance. But that's going to increase demand for central locations, well, it already has done. The vast increase in office stock that we've seen in London over the last 20 or 30 years alone is a reference to that, and you can see it happening in Manchester now as well. But how are you going to address that is a big problem for the office market. And one obvious solution is to go up, but there's a question, I think, about how long you can do that if the street scene and the transport network remains the same. The second of the three issues I'm going to talk about at the moment is environmental challenges. And this is to do with, obviously the need to create more environmentally friendly buildings, and in particular, the regulations that will basically, the goalposts will probably shift on this, I think, given what's happening generally in the economy, but that from 2027, in theory, you won't be able to let a building D or below, with an EPC or D or below, and from 2030, C or below. Now, this creates big problems for investors, for developers who are looking for buildings because they have a limited pool to choose from. But what's interesting as well is, the geography of this, because it isn't equally distributed. The problem is not equally distributed around the country. So what I've done here is put various local authorities with fairly significant office stocks in there. The right hand, the x-axis is the amount of space which is in trouble, and I've used D because I think it's a more likely possible end result at the end of the decade, given some of the issues. On the left-hand side, the percentage. And what's interesting is you can see that the City and Westminster, because they have the largest office stock, have by far the biggest problem in sort of general quantum terms, but actually in percentage terms, it's not too bad. The real challenge there is, there is evident office demand in those locations, and I'll come back to that in a second. The question is how you bring in a finance to play over a short period of time to reinvent those buildings. There's another group of office markets at the bottom left. Generally places in the city fringe, like Hackney or Islington, or fairly rapidly developing smaller centres like Cambridge, where you've had a lot of new buildings built recently. They're all pretty environmentally friendly, and they don't have too much of a problem. So there are very few buildings in comparative terms that are in that category. The big problem is the top left, where you've got some of those sort of left behind towns, for want of a better term. So Wolverhampton, Leicester, Sandwell, Park, Bradford. A few surprises up there, which are vestiges of the Sixes office boom, like Croydon and Hounslow. Peterborough maybe as well as a new town. But those are going to have big problems. And the issue here, I think, is this vicious circle on the right-hand side. Or maybe we think of the virtuous circle for places like London or Cambridge, which is that, if you, and I'll reverse it from the direction shown here. So if you have lots of new and expanding businesses, as in London, basically you have increased demand for office space, which means you get plenty of evidence that rents are going up, which means you get plenty of development and refurbishment, and you get a pretty good quality stock, which in turn brings in more businesses, brings in more development, not just for the buildings themselves, but also because of the image it produces. You have the reverse happening in the rest of the country. So what I'm saying is this process of environmental obsolescence and regulation is effectively accelerating the process I mentioned in the first chart. But I think behind this as well, before everyone wonders about whether the green agenda will come and go, is I think there's a process of accelerated obsolescence going on in the market as well, where tastes in office design, requirements from occupiers are ratcheting up and changing far more quickly than they did 20, 30, 40 years ago. So effectively, the design of offices, their function is becoming obsolescent more quickly. That has big implications for the market, but it also, I think if you map that onto this, it would look quite similar as well. And I think creates a similar cycle. The third factor is the rise of hybrid working. Now, during COVID, there was lots of talk about the office being dead. That's obviously not happened. People are evidently back in the office 3-4 days a week, and you can see that happening here. The yellow, by the way, is, and I think sometimes being in the built environment, you can get a skewed idea of what's happening in the wider world, because I think built environment professionals tend to be in the office a bit more than some others, not perhaps as much as some in the financial world, for example. But if you look at the stats, basically attendance seems to have plateaued at around 60% of pre-COVID levels. This is in London. So this is the UK as a whole, but the sample is skewed towards London. Now, there's real variation around the day of the week. So midweek, it's more like 70-80%. Monday, it's more like half. Friday, it's well down at a third. This is probably going to change a bit, I think. But the key point I'm making here is I don't think, given by the fact this is plateauing, we're going to go back to the world before COVID. People will be in the office a bit less, not as much less as people thought, I think, during the pandemic, but this will translate to lower aggregate demand for offices overall. But it has other effects as well, and just to demonstrate this isn't just a result of the sample, if you look at the transport, for bus journeys, underground journeys, tram journeys, you can see a similar pattern. It's bounced back and it's stabilising at a level that was below where we were before the pandemic. But the other point about hybrid working, I think, is that if you say that people only have to be in the office 3 days a week and work at home 2 days a week, it does, it changes transport patterns, it changes the travel to work area. So, you know, if you have to be in the office 5 days a week, unless you really, really like trains, then you need to live, you know, within a reasonable distance of the office. Maybe you'll do an hour commute a day, okay, or 45 minutes each way. If you have to be in 3 days, you may say, well, actually, you know, I could live up in Cambridgeshire or down in Sussex or out towards Bristol. And people who already live in those locations, perhaps as far as the Midlands and the South West, might say, well, actually, I could apply for that job in London if it's only 3 days a week. I wouldn't mind doing the commute, I wouldn't do it for 5 days. So the potential travel to work area has increased. And you can see this here, how rapidly it increases if you go from 1 hour, which is about this is from Bank, by the way, and I always think there's a slight underestimate, because it always takes a kind of lower average time it takes to get places. 1 hour, 2.2 million people of working age can get to your office in an hour if you're a bank. Go to 2.5 and it's about 6.7, so it's a 200% increase. And I think these advantages for companies, my view, outweigh some of the slight productivity or control disadvantages by having a more hybrid approach to work. This also means that the location within London becomes more important. So if you're near a station, near a transport node, that is increasingly of greater importance, I think, than it was even a decade ago. So what's the market evidence that all this is happening? Well, first of all, if you look at investment activity in the market overall, in commercial property, then London offices are in secular decline. The figure I point to, because the overall volumes are pretty, go up and down quite a lot, is the grey here. You can see that percentage of offices as an overall universe of transactions has gone from about a third to about 20%, while other sectors have increased, but offices are just less attractive now as an investment option for big funds than they were at any point, I think, since the 1960s. If you look at what's happening with offices in terms of overall returns for investors, this is the MSCI index. You can see that, and this is annualized. Look at say the 3 year. You're losing minus 5.5% a year on average with offices, whereas you're getting at least 1.2% for most property, up at 3 or 5% for residential or industrial. So offices isn't looking like a good investment. The most telling thing for me is, though, if you dig into that performance data, I don't want to baffle you too much with this slide, but if you look at the upper quartile and lower quartile performance, so this is the best-in-class offices and the worst-in-class offices, there's a huge variety within offices. So if you look on the left-hand side for, say, offices overall, you've got this huge kind of 5.7 percentage point spread between the best and worst, the 75th and the 25th percentile. So, if you've got a good office, you're actually doing as well as some of the other sectors, and it's performing quite well. If you've got a poor office, it's doing a lot worse. And compare with, say, industrial, where that spread, the sort of barbell or dumbbell, it goes from a barbell to a dumbbell, doesn't it? But that's tiny, which shows there's very little gap between different types of industrial unit in terms of performance. But offices, it's huge. So you're seeing this real polarisation in terms of performance. And also, if you look at the way the market's behaving towards cities, and you can see this in a smaller kind of proportion in somewhere like Manchester, but office construction is generally down across the whole country, but it's up in London and has been really since about 2020. So activity almost everywhere else is declining, whereas in London it's increasing, and it's not all of the UK, as I said, but the trend is most evident in London. And the other thing, if you dig into London itself, going back to what I was saying about micro-location being more important, is how you've got this huge spread in terms of vacancy rates by different submarkets. So you go out to somewhere like Docklands, core about 18% of offices are vacant. It's probably higher than that because there's a lot of kind of shadow vacancy that isn't really talked about, or buildings that could be available if you ask nicely. Also places like Hammersmith and Chiswick as well. These outlying locations of Croydon being really hit hard, I think. Some of those markets like Victoria is more a reflection of there being a lot of development activity recently. But the logic of being in those locations has been really destroyed, I think, by hybrid working, because those locations were where people who were very, very worried about office costs went to. And now if you're very, very worried about office costs, you just get your staff to work at home, or maybe have a smaller office in the centre of London. And the places that are doing very well, West End, of course, always does, but you can see how it tends to be those more central submarkets that are doing better. And I think there's some other things going on there to do with the function of places like Hammersmith really being torn apart by the Elizabeth line as well. You used to go to Hammersmith so you could get to Heathrow quickly by rail, or by road rather. Now you can be at Paddington and get to Heathrow by rail in a far quicker time. So the implications for me of all this, about a quarter of the office stock in the UK will become redundant over the next 5 years rather. That's not going to be equal everywhere. London has a problem, but it's probably a smaller problem than in most parts of the country. But we'll see the office market generally become more focused and more concentrated within cities as well as across the whole of the UK. And those hubs will see more development, more investment than elsewhere. It will see more commercial activity while other areas fall back. And it's where generally refurbishment's going to be viable. So if you've got a knackered old office building, it's where you'll be able to raise the funds easily to do it. Or probably a lot of that also overlaps with where there's obvious commercially viable changes of use as well. But there's some big questions as well. So there's going to be assets which don't work, which can't find the funds to revitalise. What do you replace it with? How do we think about embedded carbon and sustainability in that context? The other issue is where the money comes from, because people don't want to invest in offices at the moment. How do you get all the money in for the scale of the change that's required, given the scale of the problem that I showed in that graph earlier? And then finally, I think, what can local authorities and government do to try and support the reinvention of places? Because they still have, despite being cash-strapped and going bankrupt left, right and centre, they still have a lot of assets that they can use to try and generate changes in places, as long as they understand the underlying problems and the underlying nature of their economy. So in terms of London, just to summarise very quickly, aggregate office stock will probably decrease, but certain locations will see intensified demand. You will still see big HQ offices emerging, but generally I think the average letting size, the average office space occupied by a company will probably decrease. Everyone will want, apart from in those HQ buildings with which will probably see more attention going into their design, people will generally want more flexibility, more short-term uses, more short-term leases. There are implications there, I think, for fit-out and investment generally and how that model works. So what that means for me is that investors may have to develop stronger relationships, more service-based relationships with occupiers to try and understand what they want to make sure the building changes. There will be increasing pressure on central locations. I think the city is an obvious one where you think, if all those tall buildings are built out, what will the street scene be? I cycle across London Bridge already today, and it can be pretty packed. If we have all those buildings built out, what happens? What happens to peripheral office locations, especially if councils don't want to see them change use? And all this is being exacerbated, I think, by that ratcheting of occupier requirements, that accelerated obsolescence that I talked about earlier. And I think the question that I'll leave open is, what will this do to office design? What will it do to how the office functions, how it looks? And perhaps that's one to ponder as we go into the Q&A. But I'll pass over to Timur now to talk about what all this means for conservation.
And I'm mindful of time, so I'm going to go through this part. Maybe we can pick up some of it in the Q&A. But from the research that John's done, it's very clear there is going to be a tidal wave of obsolete office buildings coming onto the market in the next few years. Certainly, we're already seeing that. It's only going to accelerate. Some of those are going to be traditional historic buildings, because we know they're out there. Others go right up to the 1980s, 1990s. And so there's going to be a question of how do we look at change of use and rework these buildings. I think we have to be quite radical about how we're going to reimagine some of these buildings. Radical in the sense of the prospective uses, which we're already started seeing in the city. Radical in the way that 20th century office buildings are adapted, what's the art of the possible, and radical in the way we're thinking about how wider objectives mean that sites currently aren't optimising the land in the way that they should be, and particularly in a long-term sustainable way. You might not say that last point is radical because that's kind of the planning system at the moment. So, but nevertheless, not everybody sees it that way. So what are the challenges for historic buildings? And never before have we seen so much press about sustainability and conservation being considered as the same point. And we've got everything from M&S, which I'll come on to in a second, through King's College Chapel, which was in The Spectator. So that really tells you how these types of matters are being considered. And I'll come on to some of these other cases. But we know why this is such an important issue. I'm not going to go through this. We're all aware of the issues around carbon and what our industry is contributing. But using Historic England's research, there are 600,000 commercial property buildings dating from before 1919, and there'll be a hell of a lot more between 1919 and in the 20th century. Some of those will be high quality, some of those won't be. We're anticipating seeing far more considerations of whether some of those are heritage assets, given the threshold to be a non-designated heritage asset is quite low, and considerations for listing as well. We know that that's going to happen. And of course, the thing that's the project that has put this on everybody's radar is M&S, and here's just some of the press that's been generated. I have to say this slide is from a presentation I did 2 years ago, and I'm sure there's been a hell of a lot more, and not least we're expecting the decision from the Secretary of State in the next few weeks. But just to remind everybody, there were three different buildings, different periods, different floor plates, didn't join up in terms of floor levels. Some felt that the buildings could be retained and retrofitted, and others viewed that taking the broader development plan approach, which is essentially the planning case, the building wasn't listed, been turned down, the certificate of immunity, the existing buildings don't meet the land use requirements, and there's substantial public benefits, versus the other case, which is the harm to heritage assets and the conflict with sustainability and whole life carbon. We'll see where we get to with the Secretary of State in the next few weeks. But that's essentially the case you find on every redevelopment scheme. And some of those buildings, which won't be particularly high quality or have inherent issues, so looking at the challenges which many of you in the room will be more than aware of. So I won't go through what makes a building more of a candidate for retrofit than others, and this is taken from the London Property Alliance, so WPA, CPA, their research from a couple of years ago, which has just recently been updated. So what then becomes the art of the possible? How do we look at the art of the possible so we can deliver a scheme that doesn't necessarily impact on heritage, from my perspective, or other environmental considerations? On the left, we've got a scheme that's in planning at the moment. When I say we, I'm not involved with it, but it's a scheme in planning for Hesketh House. Actually, Marks & Spencer's just here, just so everyone can find their location. But essentially, do you look at quite bold, different, innovative approaches to how you alter this isn't a listed building, but it's an unlisted building in a conservation area. And then on the right-hand side, there's a scheme from one old jury, which we did get permission for, and we had to get the additional floor space to help pay for the retrofit and the works to the building. But how far do you go before you start to those impacts become unacceptable? But there's uncertainty. So just looking at two cases over the last couple of years, you've got a council refusing its own scheme to put solar panels. It's not retrofit, but it's still very minor, still on the scale of how carbon is a factor. And then King's College, Cambridge, which became a national point, as I said, the Spectator was talking about it. And in that case, Cambridge Council took the view that even small reductions in energy add up and are a material consideration that attracted weight in this, bearing in mind Historic England objected. But then we have uncertainty in Westminster. Justin, I can see it's one of your schemes that you've got two schemes that on the same street, both for redevelopment, both recommended, I think, for refusal, if I'm right, and one was approved and one was refused. I may be wrong about that. But there's still uncertainty, and how much certainty and confidence does that give the market? And then in the City of London, there is a certain amount of understanding and clear direction from the City of London. And this is from the 1st of August, where 3 retrofit schemes went through early on. But you have this variety throughout, and there is as we're working through this sort of post-M&S position, everyone's trying to find their route through. And then finally, what's happening this has been a very London-centric presentation. What's happening outside London? And this is York, where I do a number of schemes. On the left-hand side, you've got a 1970s office building called Northern House, which did have Network Rail until recently. And the retrofit and carbon argument simply wasn't on the agenda about the discussion about replacing that building. And we're doing another scheme because our client who did the one on the right-hand side went bust. So we're looking at it again. I can tell you it's just not on the agenda because politically, and maybe we can talk about this in Q&A, the city wants more development and more buoyancy for the economy. So with that, I've sort of gone through that part at lightning pace because of the timings, but with that, we'll move to...
Hi, Gordon Adam of Battersea Power Station. Thank you both. Fascinating presentation. I had a question for John on hybrid working culture and data. In that, and declaring an interest, I've been 5 days a week in the office since June 2020, so home working was not for me. But I'm private sector, public sector, it's the polar opposite. And certainly the majority of my dealings with public sector are majority working from home. And is there anything in your evidence about the sort of analysis of the two, and sort of my view of a sort of a two-tier workforce, sort of white-collar workforce, and what that means for how the city functions?
Well, I mean, I think the data there is mainly from private sector offices. So I don't know what's happening in the public sector, which will tend to be more, well, not always, but will tend to be more owner-occupied. So that data comes from a number of managing agents who have pulled their data on occupancy. So it won't be exclusively private sector, but it will be strongly weighted to that. The public sector point is interesting because you've had years and years of rationalising the public estate, which have basically reduced the number of seats available for people in the public sector anyway. So, you've got this peculiar thing where some people in government would like the public sector to come back to the office more, but actually there's no seats for them if they all did. So, there's issues around that as well. And there's going to. I think the wider point I'd make is I think it varies a lot by sector and location. So I do think that if you're in the built environment, especially if you're in the office sector, you'll tend to be in the office more for obvious reasons. It's got a vested interest in it. But I also think that, if you're in that sort of sector where complex projects need managing, it requires you to be together, talking to each other in the same place. I think that's true for a lot of the built environment generally. So it's not just vested interest, it's also the nature of the beast. But I think if you're working in a back office job, may not be that important for you to be in the office. I mean, my personal view is that I think it's probably healthy to be in the office most of the time, whether that means you have to be in every single day. If you're working in a job which is more process driven or is more of a kind of thinking job, then it's going to vary. And I think what you'll find over the next few years is that not only will there be a huge variety, but you'll get different working practices in different sectors that work best for them. I think the public sector thing, though, has to be resolved because I think it's going to create resentment in society if it isn't resolved, personally. It may not have to be them being in every single day, but being in, I think what seems to be the case in many professional services firms, in my experience, is you have to be in at least half the time. Probably more like 60-70% of the time in reality.
Vigour from Hilson Moran. I want to get your view on the perception that quite often you hear the argument that existing office buildings are not fit for purpose and that new has to come in because of things like floor to ceiling heights aren't adequate. There's not enough, there's too many columns, we want full height glass, all those usual things that come out. But recently obviously HSBC are actually moving to 81 Newgate Street, which obviously hang up there as the BT Centre. Do you think that will shift that mindset for investors, developers, mainly letting agents, actually trying to argue that those spaces aren't great compared to somewhere like, for example, the HSBC building in Canary Wharf, which HSB are moving out from?
It's a difficult one for me to answer, but I mean, the other thing is Newgate is getting refurbished heavily. That got ahead. I think it was one of the first net zero buildings. So although that's there, it's getting pretty strong.
There are some fundamentals there, like
there
the
are.
ceiling heights are limited. There's a lot of columns in that building. I'm just wondering if the perception is changing. To counteract that argument that something has to be demolished because it doesn't fit what occupiers actually want.
From what I've seen, and bearing in mind this isn't necessarily my area of expertise, is it kind of depends where and the types of people who are going to go into those properties. So if those types of buildings are likely to be outside of London, I think that's going to be more problematic. The fact is, in London, particularly some of the older buildings, more historic buildings, rather than necessarily the 80s stuff, actually they have pretty good bones and you can convert them quite well, and the rents and the commercial viability works, and you're likely to get occupiers to come in. But from speaking to clients, some of those buildings from the 70s, 80s just are fundamentally more challenging. I don't know the answer beyond.
But I mean, it's not just office reuse, is it? It's whether you convert it to things like residential or hotels or whatever else. There's other options.
Well, there are options, and that is potentially eminently more viable.
I think the other thing is that I think a lot of companies now think about, a lot of big companies especially, or successful companies, think about their offices as embodying their kind of brand more than they did in the past. And that means that, if you're a big shiny investment bank, you want to be in a brand new building and pay top rent and everything needs to look new and shiny. If you're working in advertising, maybe, then it's a very different sort of building you might want to occupy. And it will also depend upon the brand value. So even within the sectors, some will place a greater emphasis on green factors, others will place a greater emphasis on, other design factors, for example. So I don't think it's going to be a hard and fast rule. You mentioned agents. I mean, ultimately, new buildings do command the highest rents.
Daniel Watney, I was just going to supplement the answer, I think, to that question about practicality of servicing as well. So actually servicing some of these buildings with low floor-to-ceiling heights is actually quite difficult for landlords because they just won't make the EPC ratings. So you can't get the kit into those low floor-to-ceiling heights. So it's not necessarily a matter of fashion. It's actually a matter of practicality as well for office occupation.
I can see that. Absolutely. Although, I think the big change we didn't talk about in our sort of very, very rushed history section, I think this is one thing we tried to do today, was try to push too much into 1 hour. But, just the fact that you don't need computer equipment now, that everything can be done in the cloud, has fundamentally changed the way that offices work. But then at the same time, you've got greater demands now, as you say, for kind of services in offices. So you're seeing, you go into an office now and
you can't meet an EPC rating without completely resurfacing some of these older buildings.
I can see that. But I think, if I go into an office, some of the offices around here, 30 years ago, I think I'd have walked into a boutique hotel by accident. I mean, so the aesthetics have totally changed, haven't they? And what's on offer, whether it's being bought drinks and and whatever as you wait in reception. I mean, that level of service is a totally new idea.
I think that's Charlotte, I think that's fundamental. All of those buildings are going to come onto the market because they can't get up to EPC.
And they can't be occupied.
They can't be occupied. You've got to find a different use. So.
Just a quick point on the EPCs. Isn't the issue at the moment that if you use electricity, EPCs, you're penalised. As we go to more carbon zero neutral with electricity being produced sustainably, the EPCs will come down. So that point about not being able to retrofit and still keep to a carbon agenda, I think should change in the next 18 months. I don't know, someone might know more about that than I do, but that's what I've been told.
Well, I think a lot of the problems with this field is thinking too much about the individual building and not about the wider kind of urban context, the wider economic or energy generating context.
I think that is right. Looking at macro sustainability rather than individual buildings, which is often missed. I think the carbon argument has become front and centre, but there are other aspects of having a sustainable development, as many of us in the room know.
Just going to ask your thought about what goes inside an office seems to be changing quite a lot. So, for example, in Canary Wharf, their latest investment, which is now happening in terms of building construction, is nothing to do with offices. It's got to do with biotech, and lots of people seem to be going to biotech. You know, so it's not chaps sitting in or people sitting in front of a drop-down desk or something in front of their laptop. They're doing quite different things, but in a sort of office setting, in an attempt, obviously in Canary Wharf's case, to broaden their offer to keep the place going.
Well, I mean, I think life sciences over the last 5 years have become an answer to every single problem in the office market, and every time I go to I look at a developer website, they're talking about how they're branching out into life sciences, and it's going to solve all the problems of the UK economy as well while they're at it. I think the life sciences is obviously a rapidly growing industry, and it's got huge benefits both for the economy and obviously just generally for humankind. But I think there's a couple of misconceptions here. First of all, I think most of the work for kind of pure life sciences research is going to go on around the obvious universities, whether it's Oxford and Cambridge, or particularly those two, but also places like Imperial, where you've already got the life sciences campus out of White City. But secondly, there's a huge amount of other work that goes on around life sciences, which is just office-based work as well. Whether it's designing stuff on computers or designing drugs on computers, whether it's doing all the admin around life sciences. And I was told, and I'm not an expert in this field by any means, but I was told that in a typical life sciences building, about 80% of it is still conventional offices and only about 20% is labs. But it's how you get those labs to work in the office context, I think, is going to be the challenge for someone like Canary Wharf.
A presentation where, as you say, it's a bit lemming-like. We've all decided life sciences is the saviour of the traditional office centre if we're not careful, and we just got to aim off for this kind of sentiment, really.
I'm just not convinced how big it's going to be. It's not financial services or something, or it's not going to see a third of all London take-up being in life sciences. As was the case of financial services a few years ago, or law or something like that. It's something that's really important for the economy and really important in very particular locations, I think. But the idea of it being a sort of grand saviour for the office market is, if you think about it, a little bit ridiculous.
There's a tendency in offices being developed right now, at least in the square mile, to have terraces on pretty much every level, and I mean it's almost like every single development in the last 24 months has got terraces, not just the public ones that the corporation is asking for as public benefit, but for the occupants. So is this just a fad, or is it, because you didn't mention it at all, but it seems awfully consistent. So is this just a passing thing, or because we remember we had to go outside for COVID, we wouldn't get it inside, or is this permanent now?
I mean, I think there's some evidence to show that younger office workers now really like open space and light and being outside, and that was the trend that was coming before COVID, but I don't know.
I don't know. I have to say that straying into a world of planning policy that isn't my area of expertise, but my understanding is not as bad. It's requirement for amenity for office workers. So.
Okay, because my point is, if that is a requirement, that also accelerates the increase in value of the new offices and accelerates a drop in value of the old ones that don't have it. Because if you start to get used to offering an office that gives everyone on every level an opportunity to go outside, then there's an awful lot of buildings that can't be done.
But you get a different categorisation of different offices, and that's always been the case. There's some buildings that will provide those amenities and others that don't, and that's the difference between being top of the market and at the bottom of the market. And and another reason why some of those buildings are going to be obsolete very quickly.
It's not a planning requirement, but I think it's being driven by the tenants.
Yes.
So if it's being driven by the tenants, then obviously the developers are listening to the tenants, otherwise they can't let the building. But buildings are being carved out, particularly these deep plan buildings, aren't they, to create either more internal space, amenity space, or external amenity space. So therefore you're losing floor area from existing buildings, but then you try and perhaps make it up somewhere else on the development side. But I think it is being driven by the tenant who, and also with various things like well accreditation, BREEAM, all these factors come into play.
And I think that was all happening pre-COVID. I remember doing lots of presentations about the future of the office for some of my colleagues, and there was one iconic picture of some building, and I think in Boston or something, which had a running track on the roof, and that was all supposed to be a sign of where things were going. You'd have, and I think that to a certain extent that's happened, with the rise of yoga rooms and offices and this sort of thing. But I can't see that not changing, because well-being is such a big part of people's lives now. I think especially people in the first 10 or 20 years of their working lives.
Architects. I won't talk about Savile Row. You mentioned how a lot of office occupiers are getting smaller and a more serviced office offer, and the leases are getting shorter. What do you think the impact of that is on the cyclical nature of the office market?
Well, I don't know yet. I think with the main answer, I think it's difficult. It presents real challenges, I think, to the development model and the investment model that's worked in the office market for so long, which was generally you get a 10 or 15-year lease, and then you can that gives you a really strong investment that's almost bond-like, and you can sell that to an investment fund or a pension fund or whatever. I think what it means is it requires an intermediary to be able to manage the whole process, and we've seen that already start to happen with the co-working sector, but I think we're starting to see the REITs do that sort of thing now as well. So you're seeing people like Great Portland and British Land offering kind of flexible or kind of plug and play offices, shorter lease terms and so on. I can only see that growing, and I think that's the conduit with which you'll manage to create a new link between investors and developers wanting long-term guaranteed income and occupiers wanting short-term income. But it may actually also make the market more volatile as well, which I think is what you were saying.
Steve Smith, what strategies you suggest for providing cheap space for creative sectors like architects and startup companies?
Reuse, isn't it? That's the classic example for it.
What's that?
That's where you need to reuse buildings.
Potentially. Yeah. I have to say I don't know if I am the best person to be.
The reason for the question is that coming from government seems to be a desire for increasing standards all the time, which adds cost and what have you. So all the spaces where I started up, for example, was an office slum, really. But it was bloody cheap, and that seems to be a very important part of the office market, which we tend to look at the glamorous end rather than the cheap end, which drives the economy.
No, I think that's a really good question, and I think we've had this conversation many times over the last 5 years, because I think that, for want of a better word, the crap office is an important part of the UK economy. Lots and lots of small professional services firms, small creative firms operate in those sorts of environments, and they can't just simply say, we all have to go and work at home, because that isn't going to work for a lot of businesses in that sector. I don't have an immediate answer to that, because I do think it's a problem that regulation is trying to create this elite office, and what happens with at the bottom end of the market is a problem. I think the only way you're going to get around it is that if I'm right about the demand for offices shrinking somewhat, you will have some good quality offices coming out quite cheaply, and I think you're already seeing that to a certain extent, in parts of the non-core part of London. Maybe it means that you'll end up with a lot of businesses going to places in unfashionable locations where there's a reasonable amount of office stock, and that will help to revive those locations. So maybe there's some natural kind of market forces that will start to balance that out. But government has to get that right. Which brings up the whole question of whether those regulations will be enforced, as much as they could be.
Mentioned earlier the need for radical change. I'm curious to what you would suggest some of those radical changes might be.
I was thinking about, you know, if you're taking buildings, late 20th century buildings, do you take a philosophical approach to the conservation of those buildings in the same way you would do a Georgian terrace or an office building or Victorian building? And I know these are matters that are being considered, you know, probably across London at the moment. And sometimes you do have to be a bit imaginative in the way that you adapt those buildings, and they can come out and be very successful. I think that if we are too conservative in the way that we approach some of those buildings that are, you know, more likely to be assets that will be problematic in the long term, you know, we've got to step back a minute. What's the ultimate goal? And is the ultimate goal to secure the future of a building? And sometimes you need to do some quite radical things to them. And that might be physically, it could also be the uses, but then those uses need to be deliverable as well. So the other way of, that's probably where we are now. The other aspect that we're having a problem at the moment is policy. And at the moment, if we're thinking about conservation and listed buildings, the areas that I specialise in, there is statutory protection around listed buildings. You don't have the same weight being attributed to energy efficiency. That is starting to shift. There is paragraph 164 in the MPPF, but there is still the weighing exercise will always move towards conservation. And actually, I think we're at a point now where we need to be a bit more radical in the way we think about conservation.
But I think there's a danger here. If we apply conservation rules too much and we apply environmental regulations too much, we could end up with a lot of buildings that are just sitting empty and decay and and that will have huge impacts on the success of London as a city and on the UK economy. And if we don't get the balance right, you know, and everyone knows we need to keep places attractive and interesting as well, and we need to deal with the carbon crisis, the climate crisis. But there's also an alternative that is just as bad. It doesn't address the problems because, you know, you end up moving the problem somewhere else. Yeah. So, you know, getting the balance right is ultimately the big question.
Radical is one word. You might say creative is another.
Thank you.